Three major armies from Muslim-majority states signed a mutual defense treaty in Mecca, and that is only the first item on a day that also saw Iran move to tax the Strait of Hormuz. US intelligence warned that Russia could probe NATO, Ukrainian drones gut another Russian logistics giant, and North Korea prepare to send more missiles to the front. The thread is simple. Every power is rewriting its insurance policy at once, and the first place it shows is the Saudi-Turkey-Pakistan Pact. What does it take to build a new military alliance in a single day? 3 signatures in Mecca, and a war next door. 3 of the world's largest militaries in Muslim-majority states have just bound themselves together in a NATO-style mutual defense pact, and the signing location tells you exactly what Riyadh wants the world to see. In Mecca, after a joint defense summit, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif put their names to an agreement that treats an armed attack on any one of them as an attack on all. Pakistan's foreign ministry confirmed the mutual defense language, while the New York Times notes that the mechanism is still unclear in a region of volatile rivalries. The pact arrives as Houthi forces escalate inside Yemen. Al Monitor reports that a Houthi missile barrage left 58 Saudi-backed Yemeni government forces lost, and a separate drone strike in Marib province claimed 3 more members of government forces, according to a Yemeni military source cited by Macau Business. Saudi Arabia has already built a 10-nation naval coalition to protect commercial shipping, and the Houthis have recently hit Saudi oil vessels, so the timing is not abstract. What changed from yesterday is the formalization of a security bloc that did not exist 24 hours ago. Saudi financial muscle, Turkish defense industry, and Pakistani military manpower are now wrapped in a single treaty, and that combination changes the procurement map overnight. Analysts expect Turkish drone and ship orders to accelerate, Saudi funding to underwrite joint logistics hubs, and Pakistan to gain a patronage relationship that eases its own balance of payments pressure. The wider effects are immediate. Any power considering a strike on Saudi Arabia now has to weigh a second front with Turkey and Pakistan, while the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb corridors gain a new escort layer that could lower insurance premiums or, if the pact is drawn into the Yemen war, raise them further. What this signals is a doctrinal shift away from reliance on American security guarantees toward a security architecture organized by Muslim-majority states themselves. Riyadh spent years hedging between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, but this pact is the clearest sign yet that it is building a regional insurance policy of its own. For Iran, the message is that encirclement is no longer a one-sided bet. For Israel, it means a new Sunni power bloc with a combined population of more than 400 million and a nuclear-armed member. For India, the pact revives old fears of a two-front problem on its western and northern borders. The trajectory forks in 2 directions. If the pact moves quickly to joint command structures, integrated air defense networks, and regular exercises, it becomes a genuine rival to Gulf-based US CENTAM influence and a permanent check on Iranian expansion. If it stays a political declaration, the first real attack will expose who is willing to fight and who is merely willing to sign, and the resulting disillusionment could accelerate the region's arms race rather than slow it. What is still unverified is whether the treaty includes automatic military intervention or only consultation, whether nuclear deterrence is implicitly on the table through Pakistan's arsenal, and whether any of the 3 capitals has committed specific forces to Yemen. What to watch next is the Houthi and Iranian reaction, any US State Department response, and whether India begins quiet diplomacy to limit the Pact's anti-India edge. The key question is whether this is the birth of a regional defense alliance or a paper alliance that gets its first exam in Yemen. And while Riyadh builds this new alliance, the waterway that finances much of Gulf security is being renegotiated in Oman, which brings us to Hormuz. How do you tax the world's most important oil choke point without starting a naval war? Iran thinks it has an answer. Tehran says a deal with Oman to reopen the Strait of Hormuz is close to being finalized, and at the same time it is talking about banning US and Israeli ships from the waterway and charging everyone else a toll. The Guardian reports the Omani deal is nearly done, while NPR and The War Zone describe the parallel push for a selective shipping ban and a transit fee. Live update trackers from MSN say Washington has entered what officials call final talks on the Hormuz route, raising the stakes for any last-minute collapse. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and a large share of global LNG, so any change in its rules moves energy markets within minutes. President Trump, on Truth Social, claimed he has won the Iran war and that a reopening is imminent, but Tehran has repeatedly denied that it is in direct talks with Washington, which leaves the actual negotiating channel unclear. What changed from yesterday is that the Hormuz story is no longer only about a possible ceasefire or a closed strait. It is now about who gets to use the strait and at what price. If Iran and Oman jointly manage traffic, Muscat gains leverage as a broker, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi get a path for their oil, and Washington gets a way to avoid a naval shootout. The wider effects are just as important. Shipping insurers will price the risk of a US or Israeli vessel being turned back, LNG exporters will recalculate routes, and Asian buyers from India to Japan will watch every Omani statement. A toll would also give Tehran a revenue stream at a moment when sanctions have squeezed its economy. What this signals is an Iranian attempt to convert military pressure into maritime lawmaking. By offering to reopen the strait under its own terms, Tehran is trying to turn a battlefield setback into negotiating leverage, and the proposed ban on US and Israeli traffic is designed to show Washington that the strait can be open for everyone else, while still closed to American interests. For the Gulf monarchies, the message is that Hormuz is not a US-only problem anymore. For China, the world's largest oil importer, the message is that a stable Hormuz now depends on a deal with Tehran, not just American naval patrol. If the Omani deal is finalized with international monitoring and a clear dispute mechanism, the strait could reopen within days, oil prices would ease, and the immediate risk of a US-Iran naval clash would drop. If Iran tries to enforce a toll or a selective ban unilaterally, US and Israeli ships will challenge it, escort operations will resume, and the first interception could spiral into a regional shooting war. What is still unverified is the exact toll rate, how collection would work, whether the US Navy would accept Omani pilots or escorts, and whether Sultan Haytham bin Tariq's government has guaranteed Israeli-flagged traffic. What to watch next is the Omani draft text, any movement of US Fifth Fleet assets, the reaction from Saudi and Emirati energy ministries, and whether President Trump frames the deal as a personal win or a partial climb-down. The key question is whether Hormuz becomes a jointly managed waterway or the front line of a new naval blockade. And while the Gulf tries to keep Hormuz open, US intelligence is warning that Russia may be looking for a new test of NATO, which brings us to the Baltic alarm. What does a stalled war in Ukraine make Russia want to do next? US intelligence thinks it knows. US intelligence is warning that Vladimir Putin may try to test NATO with a limited strike in the coming years, and some reports say the window could be measured in weeks, not years. LBC, The Telegraph, and Ukrainska Pravda all cite the revised American assessment, which marks a shift from the earlier view that Russia would avoid provoking the alliance while it is still bogged down in Ukraine. The International Business Times and Kyiv Post also flagged the warning, noting that US intelligence has concluded Putin could act while Russia still fights in Ukraine. The scenarios being discussed are deliberately small: a land incursion into a Baltic statelet, a cyber attack on NATO infrastructure, or a staged incident that Moscow could deny. Lithuania has gone further, warning that Russia could use captured or imitation Ukrainian drones in a false flag strike against Baltic energy or rail infrastructure, a claim reported by the Kyiv Independent after a string of drone incidents in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. What changed from yesterday is that the Russia-NATO story is no longer about a theoretical future risk. It is being actively briefed by US intelligence and echoed by frontline allies. The context is Russia's stalled offensive in Ukraine and an economy that is overheating under war spending, an economy about Leistandrins. Putin needs a win, and if he cannot get it in Donbass, a cheap probe against NATO's eastern edge could rally domestic opinion and test whether Article 5 is still credible. The wider effects are already visible. NATO's Baltic air policing missions are getting more attention. Germany's plans for a permanent brigade in Lithuania are being framed as an answer, and cyber defense budgets across the eastern flank are rising. What this signals is a change in Russian doctrine. For 2 years, the Kremlin treated NATO as a red line it would not cross, while Ukrainian territory was still available to absorb. Now US analysts see a leader under pressure who may believe a limited, deniable test is safer than continuing to bleed in Ukraine. The choice of a small probe is classic escalation management. If NATO does not respond forcefully, Russia learns the alliance is hollow. If NATO does respond, Moscow can claim it was a minor incident blown out of proportion and use the crisis to freeze the Ukraine front. If NATO reinforces the Baltic states and Poland with visible combat power, tightens air and missile defense, and calls Putin's bluff through exercises announced in advance, the probe may never happen and the deterrent holds. If the alliance hesitates or responds only with statements, a small Russian incursion or cyber strike could trigger Article 4 consultations, and from there the ladder to Article 5 becomes much shorter than anyone wants. What is still unverified is the exact timing, the specific NATO member that might be targeted, and whether the intelligence warning itself is partly a leak designed to push European capitals into faster rearmament. What to watch next is any NATO statement after this assessment, new drone incidents in the Baltic states, to German troop movements toward Lithuania, and whether the US holds a public intelligence briefing. The key question is whether NATO's eastern flank is becoming a deterrent or a tripwire. And while NATO's eastern flank braces for a possible probe, Ukraine is already striking deep inside Russia's rear, which brings us to the Wildberries campaign. What happens when a war starts targeting the website where civilians buy their shoes? Ukraine just showed us. Ukrainian drones have struck another Wildberries logistics warehouse deep inside Russia, extending a campaign that is now targeting the country's largest e-commerce platform and forcing Moscow to spread its air defenses across thousands of kilometers. The Independent reports that Kyiv hit another Wildberries facility, and that satellite imagery shows about 1/5 of the retailer's storage capacity has been destroyed across the campaign. Kyiv Post cites Russian authorities, saying debris from a Ukrainian drone damaged a Wildberries warehouse in the Tver region, with no casualties reported, while Meduza notes a strike more than 2,000 kilometers inside Russia. At the same time, Russia's Ministry of Defense claimed it intercepted 605 drones overnight, a number that, even if inflated, shows the scale Ukraine is now operating at. The repeated hits show that Ukraine's drone industry can sustain long-range strikes at a tempo that outpaces Russia's repair capacity. What changed from yesterday is the combination of depth and repetition. A single warehouse fire is a nuisance. A sustained campaign against the fulfillment network that Russians call their Amazon is an economic warfare strategy. The campaign also comes as Kyiv says it needs more missile interceptors, which makes cheap, long-range drones an even more attractive way to pressure Russia's rear. Wildberries is not a military target in the traditional sense, but it is a soft node in Russia's consumer economy, and every warehouse that burns pulls Russian air defense systems away from oil refineries, ammunition depots, and military airfields. The wider effects are already showing in logistics delays, in the rerouting of civilian freight, and in the Kremlin's need to explain why a war that was supposed to stay on Ukrainian soil is now hitting shopping deliveries. What this signals is a Ukrainian shift from energy attrition to consumer logistics attrition. For 2 years, the priority was refineries and fuel. Now the priority is the distribution network that keeps the Russian home front comfortable. By hitting a household name, Kyiv is also hitting morale, because every delayed package is a small reminder that the war has a cost. The psychological effect is magnified because Wildberries is a brand ordinary Russians use, not an abstract military facility. For the Russian command, the dilemma is familiar. Either pull scarce pantsir and Tor systems to guard warehouses, or leave the rear open and accept the political damage. If Russia hardens its major logistics centers and diverts enough air defense to cover them, Ukraine may find the campaign too costly and return to energy and military targets. If Russia cannot protect the network, Wildberries and similar platforms will become recurring targets, and the Kremlin will face a steady drip of economic and psychological pressure far from the front. What is still unverified is the exact location of the specific warehouse beyond the Tver region reports, whether the 605 intercept claim is accurate, whether any drones were launched from inside Russia, and how long Wildberries can maintain service with a fifth of its storage capacity offline. What to watch next is the next target in the campaign, any Russian decision to nationalize or militarize logistics security, and whether Ukraine begins naming other consumer giants. The key question is whether Russia's rear is now too large to defend. And while Russia tries to guard its warehouses, North Korea is preparing to send more ballistic missiles to the front, which brings us to the DPRK supply line. How do two of the world's most sanctioned armies solve each other's problems? By sharing missiles. North Korea appears to be increasing its ballistic missile supplies to Russia, and a Ukrainian intelligence official says Pyongyang has now deployed not just troops and weapons, but a dedicated missile unit to support the war against Ukraine. The war zone reports that a fresh surge of North Korean missiles would be bad news for Ukraine at the worst possible moment, while Reuters, in an explainer carried by MSN, cites the Ukrainian official describing a missile unit sent alongside earlier troop and weapon shipments. The rockets are likely variants of the short-range ballistic missiles North Korea has already supplied, but the exact models and quantities are not confirmed. The development comes as Ukraine is publicly warning that it needs more missile interceptors, which means every additional North Korean rocket complicates an already stretched air defense picture. Earlier reports focused on North Korean artillery shells and individual missile launches. Today, the picture is of a structured support relationship that includes a missile unit, suggesting Pyongyang is integrating into Russia's operational planning rather than just selling hardware. That integration would let Russian planners use North Korean rockets as a disposable first wave, preserving their own precision missiles for higher-value targets. The wider effects stretch across two continents. In Europe, Ukrainian commanders must allocate more interceptors to North Korean rockets that may be harder to track than Russian equivalents. In Asia, South Korea and Japan will see the deployment as proof that Moscow is repaying Kim Jong-un with technology, fuel, or satellite know-how, and that will accelerate their own missile defense and intelligence investments. What this signals is the emergence of a formal arms for support swap between two sanctioned states. Russia gets munitions it can no longer produce fast enough, and North Korea gets a live combat laboratory and a patron that can shield it at the United Nations. For the United States, the problem is no longer separate crises in Europe and Asia, but a single logistics chain that links them. For China, the partnership is a useful irritant to the West but also a risk, because a cornered and emboldened North Korea is not easy to control. If sanctions enforcement, interdiction at sea, and South Korean intelligence pressure can slow the flow, North Korea's contribution may remain a nuisance rather than a decisive factor. If the flow grows, and the missile unit is used in coordinated strikes, Ukraine could face a new wave of mass rocket attacks that forces the West to choose between deeper air defense aid and accepting higher Ukrainian losses. What is still unverified is the exact number and type of missiles, the size and location of the missile unit, whether North Korean crews have already fired in combat, and what Russia is giving Pyongyang in return. What to watch next is any South Korean or Japanese statement, a new North Korean missile test timed to the deployment, Russian use of North Korean rockets in Ukraine, and whether the UN panel of experts can document the transfers. The key question is whether North Korea has become Russia's permanent arsenal or a temporary supplier. That brings us to what to watch in the next 24 hours. Watch the next 24 hours for 5 things. First, the Saudi-Turkey-Pakistan Pact. Look for an Iranian or Indian response and any US State Department readout, because the first reaction will tell us whether this is a paper summit or a realignment. Second, Hormuz. Watch the Omani draft text and any movement of US Fifth Fleet assets near the strait, since a toll on shipping would be enforced by presence, not press releases. Third, Russia-NATO. Watch for new drone incidents in the Baltic states and any NATO statement after the latest US intelligence warning, because a small probe is the most likely path to a big crisis. Fourth, Ukraine's rear campaign. Watch whether Russia moves air defense systems to protect logistics hubs, because that diversion is the whole point. Fifth, North Korea-Russia. Watch for a South Korean or Japanese statement and any new missile test, because the volume of transfers is the variable that matters most. If you found this briefing useful, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel with the bell so you never miss the daily update. We will be back tomorrow. See you then.